It was a late Friday evening, and I was sitting in my office going over a list of candidates for a new vacancy that had just opened up as the regional director of a chemical company specializing in eco-friendly products. For soil management, I had a lot on my plate. Our products were used by farmers to manage fertilizers and water containment, which helped keep our food supplies sustainable. We were proud to be pioneers in providing environmentally safe solutions in an industry that didn't always prioritize that. 2 of my office staff were leaving soon, both because their spouses had been promoted and were moving out of state. This meant they had to resign within the next few months, so we were moving fast to fill their positions. Our sales team worked across 8 states, and we've had a great year in the Midwest, exceeding our targets for the first time. Ruby, my executive assistant, popped into my office with the update I'd been waiting for. "Stanley, all 8 candidates have confirmed their interviews for Monday. I'm heading out for the night," she said with a small wave, as she left every Thursday. I traveled to different states within my region to lead a sales meeting, which usually took half a day. By Friday evening, I'd be on my way back home. My wife Mallory took advantage of these nights to hang out with her friends. Over the years, we've had, Bill, these trips really helped me to get to know our sales reps face to face. I was able to help them improve their performance and solve any issues. It was an investment that paid off, since we hadn't had a single resignation in 8 years, which is almost unheard of in this industry. I had just gotten back to the office in time to finish up some final tasks before heading home. The company had tried to convince me to delegate these sales trips to someone else, but I valued the quiet time they provided between Mallory, who was always in the know about everything, and the kids and I had some rare moments of reflection on those peaceful road trips. It was also important to me to keep the company's budget in check, and these trips saved the cost of hiring a sales manager. Our oldest, Olivia, was getting ready to graduate and head to university in the fall on a full scholarship, which was a huge relief financially. Our youngest, Sophie, was 16 and studying for her learner's permit. We were in a good spot as a family. Mallory and I had been married for 20 years, and she worked as the executive assistant for the district attorney. The DA had just accepted a high. He had a job with the federal government, and though he was about my age, he had never settled down. There were always rumors, but I never believed them. For the last 15 years, my parents had kindly taken our kids every second weekend, giving Mallory and me some much-needed time to reconnect. That gesture probably saved our marriage at a time when we really needed it. With Olivia set to intern at a senator's office, and we were in Washington this summer, wrapping up that chapter. But it had made a big difference for us over the years. Not long ago, my dad decided to buy ancestry kits for all 3 of our kids, with my approval. We sent them off, curious to see if any long-lost relatives would pop up. Olivia thought it would be fun to keep the results a secret from her mom until they arrived, knowing it might take 5 or 6 months. This weekend, Mallory had planned a trip to Memphis for us to see a concert at the arena, and we'd be back by Sunday. She always found ways to add special memories to our time together. I met Mallory during my senior year of college, but it wasn't a traditional kind of story. I was a vendor at one of our school's football games, selling snacks to the crowd. Her dad was part of the medical team for the football team, so she always had free tickets that day. I was there with a date, and they got into a fight over something stupid. It got out of hand, and as she pushed her date away, he stumbled into me, sending my tray of snacks flying down the concrete stairs. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed with my head wrapped in bandages. The doctor told me I had 25 stitches across my forehead from a deep cut. Mallory visited me daily, weighed down by guilt during my week. She was in a coma for a long time because of internal injuries. When I started to come around, I saw what I thought was an angel standing by my side. It took me a moment to realize it was actually Mallory, who was standing next to my then-girlfriend Lindsay. I remember feeling confused and, to be honest, a bit disappointed to see her there. I was in and out of consciousness. When I finally woke up, Lindsay was gone. In her place was a smaller piece of art that stuck by me as I recovered. Our relationship slowly grew after that, even though we never made it official. 3 months later, we were married. I'll never forget how stunning she looked walking down the aisle. She was 5 feet 8 inches, had long blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a figure that turned heads. By our 5th anniversary, though things weren't going so smoothly, we had a bit of a rough patch, and for a while we even thought about going our separate ways. But somehow we managed to stick together. One day, after leaving a popular restaurant called Charlie's Bar and Grill, which is famous for tossing bread rolls across the room, we found ourselves having a heavy conversation. The food was nothing to write home about, But the place reminded Mallory of her mom's cooking, so we made a stop on the drive home. Mallory brought up. I was taken aback when she started talking about infidelity, suggesting that I should consider having an affair. She went on to say that marriage norms were changing, and that it might actually help us understand each other better. I was quite shocked by her suggestion. It seemed selfish and manipulative, like she was giving me permission to hurt someone else for our own benefit. I couldn't hold back any longer and asked her, why on earth would you want me to cheat? Did I do something so bad that you're hoping this ends our marriage? The car fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. Mallory was always quick to respond, but this time she didn't say a word. After a few minutes, I turned the music back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. About an hour later, we were still on. We were about 40 meters from home when she turned the music off again and apologized, saying, "Stanley, I'm sorry. I think I've just been reading too many of those ridiculous romance novels. I don't know what I was thinking." She then switched the music back on, as if everything was fine. But the thing is, our kids and I all knew she hated those books. They had been her mother's guilty pleasure, but Mallory had always dismissed them as trashy and beneath her. She didn't like them, so her explanation didn't make sense. As we got closer to home, I realized there was one part of her life I'd never really questioned. Thursday nights out with her friends had always seemed harmless. On the rare occasions I was home on Thursdays, she'd skip the outing to be with me. But after that strange conversation, I found myself wondering if there was more going on. Was she going out to bars with her friends? Was she involved in something questionable? By the time we pulled into the driveway, I was determined to find out more later that night. After we'd settled in, I spent some time with my parents. They said they wanted to talk to me privately the next day and hinted they were concerned about Mallory and our youngest daughter, Sophie. I wasn't sure what they meant, but I agreed to meet them around 3. After finishing my work interviews the next morning, I let Mallory know I'd be heading to my parents' place in the afternoon. I told her we might be eating dinner a bit later, and she seemed fine with it. When my parents arrived, we gathered in my office and chatted for a bit. My dad then got straight to the point. "Stanley, I really regret sending in those ancestry kits for the grandkids. We got a match. Sophie has a grandmother on her father's side who's been searching for her son and his descendants." He then handed me a form from Ancestry. The form showed a woman's name and phone number. I could tell from my dad's expression that he knew what this meant. "Dad, I don't think this is a mistake. Let's see what we can find out." I grabbed the office phone and dialed the number on the form. I put the call on speaker and started recording it, so we'd have a record of whatever happened next. After a couple of rings, a woman answered. "This is Stanley Spencer. I'm looking for Sylvia Tate regarding a DNA match through Ancestry." I explained that I was speaking to her. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated for a second, then said, "Well, it's complicated, but I've just learned that my youngest daughter, Sophie, is your granddaughter." "Are you talking about Sophie Spencer?" she asked. "Yes," I confirmed. "Then perhaps you know my son, whom I had to give up for adoption when I was 15. Mrs. Tate continued. "I might if I knew his name." I responded, "He was adopted by a family with the last name Harper. His given name was Andrew." Her confession was like a nightmare unfolding before me. "He's alive and well," I said, still in shock. "He's the district attorney here in Butler County, and he's also my wife's boss. Now it all makes sense why he never married. He's my only child." Mrs. Tate confessed, "I'm fighting stage 4 for lung cancer, and I don't have much time left. Would you let Sophie visit me before I pass away? I'll cover any expenses. I just want to meet her and pass my estate on to her, given the situation. I'll let my parents handle the coordination. They'll arrange for her to visit this weekend." I agreed, but I couldn't allow Sophie to travel alone. "Is there anything else you need? Please provide a notary statement for my lawyer to conduct a DNA test." Mrs. Tate requested that he'll want to verify her identity before changing my will. Considering the size of the inheritance is no problem. I told her I'll pass the call to my dad, and he'll handle the details. As I was leaving my office, I gave Ruby, my executive assistant, the personal recorder to transcribe and notarize both my conversation and the phone call. "This is essential for the divorce proceedings. Should I prepare the authorization for the DNA test as well?" Ruby asked, showing her sharp understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Yes, please," I replied, "but keep it quiet for now. I need a few weeks to investigate my soon-to-be ex." I then turned to my assistant, Mark. I said, "I'll need your and your wife's help with a personal matter." I made a point of looking serious. "My wife Saudi is almost done with her dispatch for the day. I'll text her to come over immediately." Mark responded, getting the idea. Back in my office, we worked out the details. Mark and Sadi would use the spare key they had from my house to pack some clothes for Sophie next Friday. I'd pull her out of school and drop her off at their place by 10 midnight m. After dropping my parents off, I sent her to Mark's office and joined them shortly. Meanwhile, Ruby had already transcribed the documents and made the necessary copies. I gave Mark and STI a copy of the conversation I'd had with my wife. I gave Ruby the paperwork my dad had provided and instructed her to make additional copies for the lawyer. Mark and STI were close friends and were deeply affected by what I was going through. STI had grown up as neighbors with Mallory, and the truth about my wife's actions left them both. We were all pretty shocked, so we got together to think about what we could do to find out more. I suggested that Mark should use my company car for sales trips while STI took Mark's car, saying that he was going to be training for the next few months. I also started following Mallory on Thursday nights to see what I could find out. I was getting more and more suspicious, especially after Mallory had suggested that I have an affair. I was beginning to think that she was planning to run off with Andrew Harper, and that this affair could be the reason she wanted to get a divorce. STI agreed, and even suggested we even got the police involved to collect some detailed evidence that she had a contact who could help later on. Ruby gave us the lowdown on George Thompson's departure from the district attorney's office, and how he's now moved to private practice. I was asked to give George her regards when I visited him. We came up with a plan to gather more information, and I headed to meet George. He's a lawyer known for his involvement in the women's rights movement and challenging major legal precedents. His unconventional approach is making waves in the legal community as we spoke. It all started when Mallory started working under Andrew Harper, which also coincided with my promotion and increased travel for work. If they were having an affair every Thursday, I must have been blind to this deception for over 15 years. The expensive gifts Andrew had given Mallory now seemed much more suspicious. When I arrived, George was ready. He had briefed him on everything, and he handed me access codes to Andrew Harper's house and told me the alarm code. George also gave me a phone number for a team of professionals who could help discreetly. He grew up in tough neighborhoods and still had connections for getting things done quietly. The access codes would stay valid until the end of the week, when Andrew would be asked to change them. George had also come up with a plan to sue Andrew for child support, dating back to Sophie's birth. It could bankrupt him under state law, so he suggested I asked George to transfer Sophie's parental rights to my parents until the court case was over. This would avoid any claims of manipulation. When I offered to pay George up front, he refused, saying it would tip him off. Instead, he asked for a check that could be cashed once the legal proceedings began. I left feeling reassured that George had my best interests at heart. I finalized all the paperwork granting my parents temporary parental rights over Sophie. They agreed it was the best course of action after George. I'll fill you in on everything later. She drove up in her 2002 Ford Taurus. Mark was on his first sales trip, so she left her car with me and took Mark's home. My eldest, Olivia, texted me to say Mallory wasn't coming home for dinner. She was going straight out with her friends. Once Di arrived, we swapped cars and I packed my suitcase. Stanley Sadi said the team's ready. Just tell me where to go. Thanks, I replied. George wants me to call him when it's time so he can serve them personally. I couldn't help but wonder about George's personal. She had a grudge against Andrew. He's all about principles. Later that night, I watched as Mallory and Andrew left their offices in separate cars. They met up for dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. Afterward, they went their separate ways again. I followed Andrew home, positioning myself where I could see his house without being noticed. Mallory arrived first, using the alarm code to disable the system and enter. Moments later, Andrew pulled up, and they greeted each other They gave each other a passionate embrace at the door. I stopped recording as they disappeared inside. George's team had wired 6 rooms in Andrew's house with audio and video. They used a neighbor's son who was serving time but still had connections. Everything was streamed live on a private page. This provided irrefutable evidence of their affair. Around midnight, my daughter Olivia called in distress. She said, "Mum's not home and she's not answering her phone." She asked me why she should call Andrew and insist he put Mallory on the phone. I sent her a clip of Mallory's encounter with the police earlier that evening. She quickly realized her mother had been unfaithful after I sent her the clip. I asked her to open the front door as I was returning to confront Mallory. George called to inform me that he had served restraining orders on both Mallory and Andrew, barring them from coming near us. As I pulled into the driveway, Olivia opened the garage so I could park S's car inside. Olivia, I said, remember the locksmith who changed the locks? That was part of the plan, prompted by the DNA test results, which revealed Sophie's biological connection to Andrew Harper. Olivia was visibly shaken, so I held her close until she regained her composure. We then went back to the kitchen for privacy, where I played her the recording of the conversation Mallory and I had during our drive home from Memphis. It gave her a first-hand understanding of her mother's manipulative behavior. Why would Mom encourage you to cheat, Olivia? I was asked to cover for her if her actions were ever exposed. I answered, ironic. Her suggestion led to the truth coming out before we could continue. There was a knock at the door. A police officer stood there, informing us they had intercepted a taxi carrying Mallory. She had been warned about violating the restraining order and was forced to turn back that night. Olivia and I talked at length. She was stunned that her mother had been having an affair for over 16 years. How didn't we see it sooner? She asked, struggling to process it all. I explained that it was easy to miss, given how busy our lives had been. The kids were young, I traveled often, and I trusted Mallory completely. Olivia nodded, realizing how deeply Mallory had manipulated us all. I was stunned. Olivia pointed out the most painful part, that her mother Mallory had used the trust we all placed in her to maintain her affair. As Olivia went to make coffee, I noticed the first signs of dawn peeking through the windows. Just then I received a text from Mallory. She urgently asked to talk about something related to our eldest child, Olivia. I decided how to respond before I got back from my trip. I reassured Olivia and replied to Mallory's message. I declined her attempt at manipulation, telling her she could continue her plans with Andrew Harper, but without the kids. I also explained to Olivia that her mother had suggested I have an affair, not to repair our marriage, but to use it against me in divorce court. Mallory had never expected to be caught after all these years. I could see how hard it was for her. Olivia needed to hear the truth. People often find it hard to accept painful realities, but they eventually come to terms with them. I held my daughter as she cried once more. We had just managed to calm her down when my other children, Elliot and Sophie, woke up. I switched on the kitchen TV, intending to catch the morning news, and soon they joined us for breakfast. Everyone was surprised to see me at home. Then, to our shock, an image of Mallory flashed on the screen. My son turned up the volume, and my heart broke for my kid as I listened to their mother and Andrew laughing and teasing me, calling me foolish and clueless. My wife made a sarcastic comment about me, which made both of them laugh even more. The reporter interrupted and said they probably weren't laughing anymore after their plan to set me up with an escort had the scene shifted. To show George Thompson serving lawsuits to both Mallory and Andrew, the reporter provided details, and my daughter Sophie broke down in tears, running over to sit on my lap. She learned that Andrew, her biological father, was not her dad but her mother's longtime lover. Elliot summed it up well, asking what their mother's attitude toward me said about how she felt about the rest of them once Sophie had calmed down. Olivia and I explained what had happened since Mallory and I had returned from Memphis. I arranged for them to be excused from school on Friday and Monday, giving them time to process everything. Just as we were about to start eating breakfast, Sophie interrupted, exclaiming that the police chief was on the news. We turned up the volume again. The chief publicly announced that both Mallory and Spencer and Andrew Harper, our district attorney, were under criminal investigation. A special team from outside the county had been brought in to lead the inquiry. It turned out that the inquiry was being led by folks from outside the county. I couldn't help but think about how quickly private actions can become public scandals, and how unforgiving society can be when people like Mallory and Andrew are exposed. I asked the kids to sit down at the table and showed them each a copy of the letter. I told Sophie that her grandparents were going to pick her up so she could meet her biological grandmother. Her grandmother is very sick and wants to see her. There's an important reason for the meeting, but I think it's best that she explains it herself. I reassured Olivia that I was there for her if she had any questions. I then asked her to help Sophie pack for the weekend while I called my parents. Once the girl left, Elliot turned to me and asked how I was holding up. I told him that I was struggling, but I was doing my best to stay strong. Stay calm. If you're ever in this situation as a father, you have to stay strong for the people depending on you. With that in mind, I called my parents to explain what was happening. They said they would come over as soon as they were done packing their car. They still had about an hour before they needed to leave. At that moment, something shifted in my relationship with Elliot for the better. We were more connected than ever before. The three of us watched as Sophie, the daughter I had raised, left with my parents to meet her biological grandmother for the first time. I prayed that things would go well. I hoped everything would go smoothly, and that Sophie would still see me as her father when she returned. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, things were tense. Mallory had gone out to buy new clothes after having her car towed and the tires replaced. Andrew was busy reviewing the lawsuit George had served him, although they hadn't yet discussed it. Andrew couldn't deny the DNA evidence linking him to Sophie. The truth about their relationship and his status as Sophie's biological father had become common knowledge. It was turning into a political nightmare for both of them. Fraud was now a legal issue. George had sued both Mallory and Andrew in a civil suit for failing to disclose key facts. It was clear that the two of them had been deceiving me for years, even though several lawyers believed George and I had a strong case. No one was willing to get involved, likely because of George's fearsome reputation in the industry. The court case brought the exposure of their behavior on Facebook to public attention, including their plan to ruin my life. This was especially relevant given my standing in the community. Mallory, who had frequented a nearby clothing store for years, was taken aback when she was confronted there. A woman accused her of being insane, saying she should have seen the consequences of her actions coming. The woman was referring to the compromising photos of Mallory that had surfaced on Facebook. When Mallory returned to Andrew's house, she noticed a company wrapping up a service call. They assumed she was the homeowner and suggested resetting the security codes. It wasn't until later that she realized there had been no electronic signature verification. Mallory called Andrew to ask who might be trying to sabotage his new position in St. Louis. She filled him in on what she had discovered. They both suspected that this was about more than just me protecting myself. It seemed like there were political motivations involved. As Mallory made herself some coffee, she reviewed the divorce petition I had filed. It stung her to realize that her own words had led me to become suspicious. Her suggestion that I damage others' lives had given me the clues I needed. On top of that, the DNA match from Ancestry. The truth about Sophie's parentage had already come out on the internet, threatening to tear apart our family long before Sophie was even born. She realized I had orchestrated the events of the previous night, revealing all the hidden truths about her life as she took another sip of coffee. The doorbell rang, and when she answered it, she found Mr. Harrison, the neighbor. Andrew didn't like Mr. Harrison. She greeted him. "What can I do for you?" Handing him a legal envelope. He explained, "Stanley used my place as a base for everything last night. I let him in after Andrew Harper got my son sentenced to the maximum. The information in this envelope will be shared with the rest of your family today as well." Stanley had asked him to. Mallory took the envelope back to the kitchen and opened it. Inside were photos and videos that incriminated her. They showed her entering Andrew's house with her key, greeting him at the door, and engaging in intimate activities. They also included footage of her confrontation with the police. The last document was a signed letter from me revealing the potential public fallout that could severely damage her future. By the time I returned from Memphis, the letter read, "It was clear you were planning our divorce. I've spent days trying to understand what made your affection for me turn into such animosity. I now realize that you blame me for. You see your marriage as a failure, especially when we had only 2 children. You felt trapped and longed for your single days. That's why you turned to Andrew to feel free again. You let him take you away from a life you despised for a few hours each week. You stayed in the marriage not because you loved me, but because Andrew didn't want to be a dad, not even to his own kids. You couldn't leave the kids with a man you saw as worthless, so you stayed married for years. Every time you and Andrew avoided the consequences of your actions, your hatred for me grew. How much did you two of you laugh at my expense? Did belittling me make Andrew love you more? What I cannot forgive is the message you and Andrew have sent to our children. It will shape their lives forever. I've yet to fully understand how much amusement you both got from mancating me and using our children like pawns on a chessboard." I concluded the KBX news. The reporter summed it up perfectly. "Are you still laughing at Stanley Spencer? I watched Olivia, Elliot, and Sophie as they heard you mock me on live TV, and it broke my heart." Our son Elliot said, "At best, if you see me as trash, what does that say about how you see them?" The letter ended with, "You've made sure our children's relationship with you is non-existent. You and Andrew can enjoy branding me a fool forever." Mallory's hands shook so much as she read the letter that she dropped the papers. She was consumed with bitterness, showing no care for me, our children, or anyone else. She was selfish and driven by her own desires. Tears welled up in her eyes. I had a way of calling out people she wasn't open about her flaws, and my words had hit her hard. I saw her actions for what they were, efforts to preserve her own lifestyle, not motivated by love. I also realized that Andrew had likely been pressuring her to leave me and the kids long before Sophie's birth, but his new job had forced them to rush their plans by now. Mallory wasn't. She was no longer laughing. She knew that I had exposed their actions for what they were, and she would have to face the consequences. It felt like a declaration of war if Andrew Harper went down, and she intended to drag everyone with him. Mallory continued reading the divorce petition, and I could tell it was tearing her apart. One of the lawsuits accused them of fraud for hiding Sophie's real parents. The possibility of fines and damages made her sick to her stomach. If I won the case, she and Andrew would face financial ruin. Mallory and Andrew had both underestimated me, assuming I was the fool they thought I was. Saturday was pure chaos for my 2 eldest children and me. From morning until about 4 in the afternoon, family members kept showing up. Mallory's parents, her 2 brothers, 1 sister and their spouses, all came by to offer support. Each brought one of their favorite dishes, making sure we had plenty to eat. Even my brother and sister came in from out of town to check on us. Despite everything, we were surrounded by love and care. Each visitor struggled to understand how Mallory could have hidden her betrayal for so long. They all agreed that the evidence from social media was clear. She was trying to destroy me, driven by hatred. At one point, my lawyer and I went out to the back deck. He told me to let go of whatever was stressing me out, saying he'd keep others away until I felt better. He said he'd revise his will and give my 3 children a bigger share of Mallory's inheritance. He couldn't forgive her for what she'd done. Later, I got a call from my dad. He told me that Sophie had met with Mrs. Tate, and that the meeting went well. Mrs. Tate was kind and understanding, helping Sophie open up about her feelings. The lawyer got the necessary blood sample and had a private conversation with my father. They talked about Andrew Harper, and my dad shared what we knew. It turned out that Andrew's biological father was serving a life sentence for a major crime, and Sophie's arrival had complicated his inheritance. I reassured my father that George Thompson had taken legal. My parents were staying at Mrs. Tate's estate where Sophie was spending the weekend. They liked Mrs. Tate and said that seeing Sophie had brought a smile to her face after a long time. My mom spoke with Mrs. Tate, who expressed gratitude for how we were handling everything. Mrs. Tate plans to leave everything in a trust for Sophie, which I would manage until she turned 25. We managed to get through the call until she turned 25. Then I asked my parents to text me when they were on their way home with Sophie so I could be there when she arrived. I sent a message to Sophie telling her that we all missed her and loved her. Finally, we had a moment to tidy up the house before Mark and Sadie arrived with my car. I apologized to STI for forgetting to return it. She mentioned that the police chief saw an opportunity to take down Andrew Harper. George had provided some evidence to help the investigators, but Mark said that it was questionable. He also said that the atmosphere at the office was tense, and that many people were upset. Mark told me that some of the staff had known about the situation for most of the week, and were offering support where they could. I reflected on how it had been an emotional roller coaster since Thursday night. The kids were still struggling at times, so I decided to take Monday off as well. I'd also take Monday off. She asked if I'd heard from Mallory, and I said I hadn't since Thursday night. I figured she and Andrew were busy moving on with their lives, having made it clear how they saw us in public early Sunday morning. My youngest daughter called to ask if it was okay for her and her grandparents to come back late on Monday. I said yes, as long as it was okay with her grandparents. She thanked me for making her go and explained that Mrs. Tate had helped her come to terms with the fact that it wasn't her fault her mother's affair had brought her into the world before hanging up. She told me she loved me on Monday evening. Olivia Elliott and I stood by as my parents pulled into the driveway. They looked worn out from the weekend. As soon as my mom got out of the car, she rushed into my arms. It was such a relief to have my youngest daughter back home. My dad opened the trunk and brought in Sophie's suitcase. Elliott took a suitcase up to her room, and the 3 of them sat down in the family room to catch up. Sophie shared stories about meeting her new grandmother, while my parents and I retreated to the kitchen. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee while they shared their thoughts on Mrs. Sylvia Tate. She seemed at peace when we left. My dad remarked that it was like meeting Sophie had brought her some closure and that she was ready for what's coming. My mom pulled out a legal. She took an envelope from her bag and gave it to me. Mrs. Tate's lawyer gave it to me with instructions. I opened it and found a letter and a check for $50. The letter was short and sweet. Mrs. Tate thanked me for honoring her request and mentioned how she'd lived longer than expected since our first contact. She confirmed the DNA connection and commended me for how I'd raised Sophie. She asked me to use the funds to help my family get through the tough times we were facing and to stay true to my values. I let my parents read the letter, and we reflected on how we might have helped fulfill someone's dying wish over coffee. I filled them in on everything that had happened while they were away. I told them I think the worst of the emotional storm is behind us and that we can finally start getting back to normal. The rest of the week went pretty smoothly, all things considered. Mallory tried reaching out to each of our kids by phone, but they didn't want to reconnect. Meanwhile, corporate headquarters was happy that I had finally stepped away from managing the sales meetings, and they started that process. They were looking for a new sales manager, which they hadn't done in over a decade. I was in my office looking over the monthly sales figures when Ruby walked in looking concerned. I asked what was wrong, and she explained that my recent letter to Mallory had been posted online in the opinion section of a regional Kansas newspaper. We quickly pulled up the site and found the letter. Ruby read it aloud, and I nodded, saying that I had written it during a moment of emotional distress. I wondered if I had been too harsh. Ruby shook her head. "Stanley," she said firmly, "the letter just lays out the reality of Mallory's actions in a direct way. Either one of them could have ended the affair and come clean, but they didn't. Andrew enjoyed all the benefits without bearing any of the costs. We talked about how rare it is for people to see the fallout from someone's actions in such a public way. Ruby, having gone through her own divorce, said the letter served as a reminder of the pain people go through before finding peace. She then highlighted a comment on the site from a longtime feminist. This comment highlighted how Mallory and Andrew's actions had set back the movement for AAL and empowerment. That night, Mallory and Andrew went to Charlie's Bar and Grill for dinner. It was a busy Friday, but they were surprised to find the place unusually empty. There were vacant tables everywhere. When they asked the waitress why it was so quiet, she explained that people were waiting, but they refused to be seated near them. It was likely that most people had read the letter I had written to Mallory, which was now posted on the newspaper's website. They were feeling uncomfortable, so they quickly asked for the bill and left as they exited the restaurant. Mallory spotted her parents at a nearby table, waiting for their meal. She walked over to greet them, with Andrew trailing behind her. Her father, without turning to face her, said coldly, "Mr. Harper, I suggest you take your mistress and leave so my wife and I can enjoy our meal in peace." Mallory left in tears. She knew there was no going back, and that she'd have to live with the consequences of her and Andrew's actions for the rest of her life. Back at Andrew's place, they checked the newspaper website and saw the public's overwhelming disapproval. Their actions had significantly shrunk their social circle. I sat in the passenger seat of my car watching as Sophie drove us to Wichita, Kansas. We'd received news that her grandmother Sylvia had passed away, and we were heading to we caught the private plane from the airport to Kansas. Sophie was really affected by her grandmother's death. She and her grandmother had been close, and they'd spoken often. Olivia and Elliot were great. They supported us all and even encouraged me to start dating again. I wasn't sure about it, though. Meanwhile, Andrew and Mallory had moved to St. Louis. Andrew was allowed to start his new federal job early. The county was eager to get rid of him after paying over $45,000 in questionable expenses. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment and faced the reality of a potential bankruptcy due to the civil fraud lawsuit. They were only allowed to keep $10,000. In equity, our divorce was finalized under state law. Mallory was required to pay child support for our kids while they were still in school and cover 50% of their living expenses. If they chose to live on campus, the civil trial for fraud was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. My kids still refused to speak to their mother, and her side of the family had distanced themselves from her as well. She had learned the hard way that people only tolerate so much before they walk away for good. Sophie had been forced to attend a state. She had to have a meeting with her biological father, Andrew. It didn't go well. She told him in front of the child service representatives that both he and her mother were dead to her. We went to her grandmother's funeral. After the service, the lawyer revealed the substantial inheritance left to Sophie. Sophie and I decided to sell her grandmother's house and most of its contents, keeping only a few pieces of jewelry and some family photos. By the time we got back from the funeral, I'd started preparing for the first day of the fraud trial, which was scheduled for Wednesday. I was organizing some paperwork when Sophie came into the den and asked if I could arrange a meeting. On Tuesday, she wanted them to fully understand the real cost of their actions. She got the idea from her grandmother, Sylvia. I called George and set it up on that bright, sunny Tuesday. We all sat down at the meeting. Sophie stood up and explained that she had called the meeting to address Andrew, her biological father. Sophie handed her father a sealed envelope with information about his own father's location in prison and his request for Andrew to visit him. She also told him the details of her conception and revealed that her biological grandmother had left her over $1 million in a trust managed by me until she turned 25. That inheritance would have if the truth hadn't been uncovered. She told Andrew and Mallory that the legal consequences could get worse if they didn't think about mediation before going to trial. As we left the meeting, I felt proud and humbled. My daughter had told her story, and whatever the future held, I knew I had been given a real blessing.